I have been teaching people how to read wood for 35 years. Where the grain runs. Which direction takes the force? Which direction splits? You can look at a piece of white oak and know, before you ever touch a tool to it, where it wants to break. The grain tells you. You just have to look long enough. I spent 35 years teaching that to teenagers in Sevier County, Tennessee, most of whom showed up to my shop class because they thought it would be easier than chemistry. Some of them were right. A few of them actually listened. And occasionally, maybe once or twice a decade, you got a kid who understood the thing you were actually trying to teach, which wasn't how to cut a joint or sand a surface. It was how to pay attention. How to see what's already in the material before you start trying to change it. My wife Dorothy used to say, I was the only man she'd ever met who could have an entire conversation with a piece of lumber. She meant it as a compliment, mostly. Dorothy died 3 years ago. She had been a third-grade teacher for 28 years. She died in the fall, 4 months after the diagnosis, and the house afterward had the particular silence of a place that used to contain more life than it does now. I am telling you this because nothing in the story I'm about to tell makes sense without understanding that. The loneliness after Dorothy. The way it doesn't announce itself loudly. It just settles in like a temperature change, gradual, and then suddenly the only thing in the room. My name is Arthur. I am 64 years old. And I am going to tell you about an ordinary Tuesday morning when I stopped at the county recorder's office to pick up a permit, and the world I thought I was living in shifted roughly 45 degrees. I met Carol at a community garden project. 18 months before this story really begins. The garden was 3 blocks from my house, run by a neighborhood association I'd barely paid attention to for 20 years while Dorothy was alive. After she passed, I started showing up to things. That's something nobody tells you about grief. Eventually, you have to go to the places where people are, even when being around people is the last thing you feel like doing, because the alternative is sitting in a house that has exactly twice as much silence as it should. Carol was there planting tomatoes in the 3rd week of May. She had dark hair going silver at the temples, and she asked me what I thought about companion planting. I told her what I knew, which was more than she expected. She laughed. I was not looking for anyone. I want to be clear about that. You hear that phrase and you know what it means. The person says it and what they mean is. I was surprised when it happened, but I am using it in the literal sense. I had genuinely decided, somewhere in the 2nd year after Dorothy, that the life I had was the life I was going to have. I was not particularly unhappy about this. I had the shop. I had Earl. I had Saturday mornings driving back roads while the mountains were still cold. Carol changed that. Not dramatically, nothing with Carol was dramatic, and I now understand that this was by design. Gradually. Sunday drives. Dinners at her place. Weekends at the farmer's market. She met Sarah, my daughter, over Thanksgiving. Sarah seemed to like her. I gave Carol a key to my house in February because she was helping me with a project I was doing in the backyard, and it made sense for her to be able to get in and out while I was at the hardware store. She kept the key. I didn't think about this until later. We were engaged as of last November. Not a ring and dinner event. Just an honest conversation at my kitchen table about whether we wanted to keep moving in the same direction. We agreed. We did. I bought a simple gold band from a jeweler in Gatlinburg. We hadn't set a date. That last detail turned out to matter. The 2nd Tuesday in April. I needed a zoning permit for an extension I was planning on the garage workshop. Nothing complicated, just a variance, the kind of paperwork that takes 10 minutes at the county recorder's office, if you know what you're asking for. Which I do. The clerk was a woman I'd seen there twice before. She was efficient and impersonal in the way that county employees who are good at their jobs tend to be. I gave her my name and address. She typed. She looked at the screen. Then she said, without particular emphasis, I see, there's a mechanic's lien filed against your property from last month. Are you here to discuss that as well? I said. I'm sorry? She turned the monitor slightly so I could see it. A lien had been filed against my property 11 days earlier by a company called Four Seasons Property Services LLC. The amount was $28,500. The description read, "Materials and labor for residential renovation work performed January through March." I looked at the screen for a moment. "I need you to print everything you have on this," I said. I sat in my truck in the county parking lot for 20 minutes after that, reading through the printout with the engine off. The air was cool enough that my breath fogged slightly against the windshield. January through March. Those were the 3 months that included the 3 weeks I had spent in Nashville visiting Sarah after she'd had her appendix out. 3 weeks when Carol had been at my house regularly, helping with things, keeping an eye on the place. I had been grateful for this. I had said so. A mechanic's lien is a legal claim against a property for work performed on it. It's filed by contractors when they haven't been paid. I knew this because I'd dealt with the other side of it twice in my contracting years. Once as a subcontractor, waiting on payment. Once as a property owner disputing work quality. What I was looking at was a lien filed against my home for $28,500 in work I had not authorized, contracted, or been aware of. I sat in the truck and I thought about what a piece of wood looks like when you've been looking at the surface and missed the grain underneath. I am a methodical person. 35 years of teaching requires that if you are not organized, you lose them. You lose the thread of what you were teaching, and the students feel it before you do, and then you spend the rest of the hour trying to get it back. I drove home. I made coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and began writing down everything I could remember about January through March. The 3 weeks I was in Nashville. Mid-January to early February. Carol had a key. She had been at the house at least 4 times during that period, by her own account. I had called her from Nashville and she had mentioned small things. A faucet that was dripping. A cabinet door she'd tightened. I opened my laptop and went to the Knox County property records. I searched for Four Seasons Property Services, LLC. The company had been registered in March of the previous year. I searched the registered agent. The name was Neil Foster. I didn't know the name. I had never heard Carol mention it. I searched Neil Foster plus Sevier County. Then Knox County. Then I expanded the search. What came back over the next 2 hours? I barely moved from the table. Just coffee and the legal pad and the quiet of the house was a pattern. Four Seasons Property Services, LLC had filed mechanics liens against 7 properties in 3 counties over the past 4 years. The company had been dissolved and re-registered twice under different names. Before Four Seasons there was Summit Ridge Contractors. Before that, Blue Ridge Home Services. I looked at the addresses of the other 7 liens. I went to the Knox County Assessor's database and looked up the property owners. 3 of the 7 were single men over 60. 2 were widowers. 1 was a divorced man. The other 3 were mixed a couple, 2 women, one of the women with a lien that had been settled at a significant discount when she'd threatened to report the contractor to the state board. I sat back in my chair and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. The garden Carol and I had started together last spring. The fence I'd repaired for her, the raised beds I'd built. I thought about Carol asking me, in January, whether I'd ever thought about updating my kitchen cabinets. I had said I might think about it. She had offered to get some quotes from a contractor she knew. I said, out loud to the empty kitchen, "Okay." Then I picked up my phone and called Earl. Earl Washington taught math at the same school I did for 22 years. He retired 3 years before I did and immediately became the head coach of a youth basketball program at the community center, which is what Earl does with surplus energy and structural inability to not be teaching something. He arrived 40 minutes after I called, which is fast for Earl because Earl does nothing fast. He came through the back door without knocking. He hasn't knocked in 18 years and set a bag of chicken biscuits on the kitchen table and sat down. I walked him through everything I'd found. Laid it out in the same order I'd assembled it, because that's how Arthur explains things. Beginning to end, no editorializing, just the structure. Earl listened without speaking, which is one of Earl's primary skills. When I finished, he sat for a moment looking at the legal pad. Then he said, "You already know what you have to do." I said, "I know what I have to do about the lien and the legal situation." "That part isn't complicated," he said. "Then what are you calling me for?" I said, "I'm calling you because I taught 17 and 18-year-olds how to see what's in a piece of wood for 35 years and I did not see this." Earl was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that came out like it was a fact about numbers, not a thing about human beings. "You were lonely, Arthur. That's not the same as being stupid." I looked out the window. People who know how to spot lonely, Earl said, have an advantage over people who don't. That's not your failure. That's their skill. He ate a biscuit. I ate a biscuit. We sat there for a while. Before he left, Earl said one more thing. He said, "Don't do anything fast. You've had the information for one day. Give it a day." I said I would. I didn't entirely keep that promise, but I came close. Fund 6 the workshop. 40-0, 46-30. That night, I went into the garage workshop. I don't know exactly why. Not to work, I didn't turn on the main lights. I turned on the single bulb over the main workbench and stood there in the middle of the shop. The way you stand in a room you need to be in but don't know what to do with. The shop smelled like sawdust and linseed oil and the particular cold of a space that hasn't been heated enough in winter. It's a smell I've had in my nose since I was 19 years old, when I first started learning the trade. Dorothy used to say I always came inside from the shop smelling like a forest had been through a library. Carol's boxes were stacked against the far wall. 4 of them, cardboard, her handwriting on the sides. She had been moving things to my house. Incrementally, not officially, but incrementally, the way water finds its way under a door. I hadn't noticed how much of the shop she'd changed. Her gardening tools organized on a wall where I used to keep my clamps. A small table she'd brought over placed in the corner near my lumber rack. Things positioned as if she'd been here long enough to have opinions about where things went. In the middle of all of this, against the back wall, was Dorothy's desk. I had started it in the spring of 2018. Dorothy had found a picture in a magazine, a simple writing desk in cherry wood, clean lines, a single drawer on the right side. She had gotten out a pencil and paper and drawn out the dimensions she wanted, right there at the kitchen table, and handed them to me like she was submitting a work order. That had made me laugh. The desk was 80% finished. The joinery was done. The drawer worked. The legs were mortised correctly. But I had never sanded it down past 1-2-0 grit, and I had never applied the final finish. There was a quality to the surface that was still rough in the places that should be smooth. I had not worked on it in 3 years. I picked up the chisel. The old one with the sawn handle I'd made in 2015. I didn't do anything with it. I just held it the way you hold something familiar when the rest of things feel strange. I stood there for a long time. And then, in the quiet of the shop, I did something I hadn't done since the first fall after Dorothy died. I sat down on the floor next to the unfinished desk and I cried. Not because of Carol. I want to be clear about that. Because of Dorothy. Because I had let the desk sit unfinished for 3 years. Because somewhere in the 18 months of Carol and community gardens and Sunday drives, I had not found my way back into this shop to finish the thing I'd started for my wife. And now Carol's boxes were against my wall and Dorothy's desk was still rough-surfaced and I was 64 years old and the life I wanted had not been the one I was building. I sat there until the shop went completely cold. Tom handles real estate and property matters. He is 60 years old, keeps long hours, and has the specific patience of someone who has spent decades watching people discover things they should have discovered earlier. He did not make me feel foolish. That mattered. Tom confirmed what I already understood. The lien was illegal. The work had been performed without my knowledge or consent. Under Tennessee law, a mechanic's lien requires a contract with the property owner, not with whoever happened to have access to the property. Tom would have it removed. He would also be filing a complaint with the Tennessee Contractors Board regarding Neil Foster and all three incarnations of his company. I asked Tom, "Can you find out if there are any other active liens associated with this company?" He said he would pull everything. What came back the next day was a list of 6 current and recent liens across 3 counties. Tom pulled the property owner information on each one. I sat at the kitchen table with the list. I recognized the emotional profile immediately. I'd been studying it for a week, in the mirror and in the records. Older. Single. Properties that suggested the specific kind of financial stability that comes from a long life of careful work, paid-off houses, no outstanding mortgages. I called the first number. Valerie Thornton was 71 years old, and she had retired from 30 years of teaching middle school music in Hamblin County. She answered on the third ring with the careful voice of someone who doesn't recognize the number. I told her my name. I told her I had found her name in connection with a mechanic's lien, filed by a company called Four Seasons Property Services. I told her I wanted to know if she was aware of it. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "How did you find this?" I said. The same thing happened to me. The silence changed then. I don't know how to describe it except that it was the silence of one person recognizing another. We talked for 45 minutes. Valerie had met a man named Roger through a church volunteer program 8 months earlier. Roger had introduced her to a contractor named Neil for some kitchen updates. The updates were done when she was visiting her sister in Georgia. The lien arrived 6 weeks later. "I've been too embarrassed to tell my daughter," she said. I said, "I understand that feeling." She asked me how I found the connection. I explained the property record search, step by step, the way I'd explain the grain of a piece of wood. She was quiet while I talked. Before we ended the call, she said, "Why are you telling me this?" I thought about Earl saying, "That's not your failure. That's their skill," I said. "Because I didn't want you to think you were the only one." Over the next 4 days, I called 3 more people on the list. 2 answered. 1 had already figured it out on her own and was in the middle of legal action. 1 hadn't known anything until I called. I submitted everything: property records, lien filings, company registration histories, a timeline I'd built on 2 pages of legal pad to the Knox County Sheriff's Economic Crimes Unit, the Tennessee Contractors Board, and the Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. I did not call Carol. I did not contact Neil. I did not go anywhere near either of them. Tom said that was the right call, legally. Earl said that was the right call, personally. I said, "Earl, I've been teaching kids for 35 years that if you try to force a joint before the glue sets, you ruin the joint. This is the glue setting." Earl said, "Okay, I'll allow the woodworking metaphor." She called on a Sunday evening, 9 days after I'd found the lien. I was in the workshop. The main light was on. I had started work on Dorothy's desk for the first time in 3 years, moving through 150 grit, then 180, then 220, taking the surface down to where it wanted to be. There is a point in finishing cherry wood when the grain opens up and the color deepens and the wood becomes what it was always going to become when it was still a tree. I had missed being at that point with something. My phone was on the workbench and I saw Carol's name on the screen. I looked at it for 1 ring. Then I picked it up. "Arthur." Her voice was careful, measured. The voice of someone who doesn't know what they're walking into. "Carol, I want to explain," I said. "I have one question first." She was quiet. I said, "Is there anyone else? Not did you cheat on me? Not why did you do this to me? I meant, was there someone else in a house like mine?" Someone else who was sitting in a workshop at this moment or lying awake in a house that was too quiet, someone else whose name I hadn't found in the lien records. She didn't answer immediately enough. That's the thing about 35 years of asking teenagers questions whose answers you already know. You learn to hear the silence between thinking about it and not telling you. I said. Okay. She said. Arthur, please. I said. I hope it works out for you. I hung up. I stood at the workbench for a moment. The shop smelled like cherry wood dust and linseed oil. Outside, the spring evening was still and cool. I picked up the chisel and went back to work. Tom had the lien removed in late April. The investigations by the contractors board and the sheriff's office were ongoing. As of the time I'm telling you this, I was told by the economic crimes officer that the information I'd submitted had been helpful in a way that suggested the word was carrying more weight than it usually does. Neil Foster and Carol Simmons are not my problem to solve. That's something I had to understand as a fact, not just tell myself as a principle. Their choices are their choices. The harm they caused is not proportionate to the amount of anger a person can reasonably carry, which is a sentence that sounds simple and is the hardest thing I've said in this entire story. I started teaching Saturday woodworking classes at the community center in May. They'd been asking me for 2 years and I'd always had a reason not to. I didn't have that reason anymore. The first class had 9 people. Ages ranging from 15 to 73, a teenage girl who wanted to build shelves for her bedroom. A retired dentist who had always wanted to make furniture. A man about my age who said his late wife had always wanted a jewelry box, and he wanted to learn how to make one. I recognized something in that last man's face when he said it. I didn't say anything about it. Some things don't need to be said out loud. What I told all of them, in the first class, is what I tell everyone I teach. You are going to make mistakes. You are going to cut with the grain when you should have cut against it. You are going to rush a joint because you're tired or impatient, and the joint will fail, and you'll have to start over. That's not failure. That's the process. The only real mistake is not paying attention to what the material is telling you. I said this and I meant it about wood. I also meant it about everything else. Dorothy's desk is finished now. It sits in the corner of the classroom at the community center. I sanded it down to 320 grit and applied 3 coats of tung oil over 2 weeks, the way the wood needed it done. The cherry came up exactly as I knew it would, warm, deep, with that particular red in it that only shows when you've taken the time to let the grain open properly. I never told any of the students it was Dorothy's. I didn't need to. It's just a desk that's in the room where we work. But I think about her every time someone runs their hand across the surface and asks who made it. I've been thinking about something Earl said the morning after all of this started. He said, "You were lonely, Arthur." That's not the same as being stupid. I've been turning that over for months now. Here's what I've come to. Loneliness is not a flaw in the wood. It's just part of the grain. You don't cut it out. You work with it. You learn where it runs and you make something that takes that into account. I'm still learning how to do that. At 64, I'm still learning. But the shop smells right again. The desk is finished. On Saturday mornings, there are 9 people in a room learning how to pay attention to what's already in the material. That's enough. That's more than enough.